Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 15, The Second Round. By the middle of September, what may be called the first round of the World War was over. The Battle of the Marne was decided, and the great thrust on Paris embodied in the Schlieffen Plan had definitely failed. The expulsion of Rennenkampf from East Prussia had ended the Russian invasion of Germany. Almost simultaneously, the Battle of Lemberg had resulted in a Russian victory. France had survived the onslaught, Germany had destroyed the Russian invasion, and the whole Austrian army had suffered defeat. The slaughter of these battles, in which all the best-trained troops of the warring nations had been desperately engaged, had exceeded anything which history records of the past, and was destined to surpass any other month, even of the Great War itself. The antagonists, gasping and streaming with blood, but still possessed of unmeasured resources, their full wrath unloosed, paused for a moment to rearrange their armies and refill their ranks, to replenish their ammunition and shape their plans anew. The twin defeats of the Marne and around Lemberg had been decisive in their influence upon the neutrals. Romania had actually decided at the beginning of September to make proposals to the Central Powers for alliance. During the critical hours of the nth, Count Czernin, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador in Bucharest, had telegraphed to Vienna that Romania was prepared to take an active part against Russia if the territory of Suceava were ceded to her in reward. Conrad, in his extremity, had clutched at this. But under the decision of the battlefields in France and Galicia, the offer was suppressed before it could be accepted. Bulgaria, the spectator of the Austrian repulse by Serbia, wrapped herself in impenetrable reserve. We shall come to Italy later. Even as early as August 10th, Moltke's quality had been judged inadequate, and his successor was openly discussed. Now, on the 12th of September, he was dismissed from the Supreme Command, and Falkenhayn, who at the outbreak had been War Minister, ruled in his stead at Supreme Headquarters. The dismissal was veiled in secrecy and pretense. No public proclamation was made. Moltke became ill. He dropped out, and gradually it was understood that a change had occurred. The new commander was a soldier of ability and distinction. He was comparatively young. He had passed through all the grades. He had a high degree of personal charm and the broad outlook of military statesmen. Many good judges consider him the ablest soldier that Germany produced during the whole war. He had been a convinced adherent of the Schlieffen Plan in its integrity. He had watched with misgivings and even disapproval the cumulative weakenings of the right-hand wheel which had marked Moltke's concessions to the pressure of arguments and events. To these he attributed the miscarriage. His first resolve on assuming power was to restore the Schlieffen Plan to its original form, and in spite of all the changed conditions, to carry it through with his utmost resources. For this purpose he ordered the greater part of the 6th and 7th Armies to be transported from the Alsace-Lorraine front to strengthen, with overwhelming force, the German right, and thither also he proposed to direct the 4 new army corps of youthful volunteers, which had been formed upon a strong professional framework in the first enthusiasm of the war. Opportunity, however, had gone. Indeed, but for Joffre's slowness in making up his mind, the German right flank would itself have been turned at the very outset of Falkenhayn's command. Montloury's army, which from September 10 faced east, had only to be marched north, to begin an outflanking movement in which all the priorities rested with the French. Nevertheless, as Joffre gradually and tardily perceived the situation, he began to reach out his left hand, and corps after corps, withdrawn from his right wing, was sent to prolong the French line to the northward. Thus, in succession, the German corps arriving from Alsace-Lorraine found themselves confronted at each point by the similar movement from south to north, which was taking place on the French side. This process quickened every day and developed into a series of would-be outflanking encounters known to history as the Race to the Sea. By the end of September, Falkenhayn realized that the day of the Schlieffen Plan was gone forever. His second resolve was the great drive against the Channel ports. Most of his 6th and 7th armies had by now been employed in filling the newly extended German front from the neighborhood of Noyon, where its right had rested on September 10, to the neighborhood of Lille, where it was established by the 20th of the month. There remained, however, the 4 new corps from Germany, the 3rd Reserve Corps, and detachments investing Antwerp, together with various other forces gathered from the front or released by the capitulations of Maubeuge. Falkenhayn's new plan was to secure his right flank by taking Antwerp and settling once for all the Belgian army, and thereafter to thrust in about La Bassée and strike in the direction of Boulogne. Between these two horns of attack, one driving through Antwerp along the coast, the other converging westward from La Bassée, Falkenhayn hoped to catch the remains of the Belgian army and any French or British troops in the Pas-de-Calais, and at the same time become master of all the seaports from the mouth of the Scheldt to the mouth of the Seine, by which British aid could come to France and Belgium. However, a succession of unforeseen and untoward events obstructed this design. The British army had begun to withdraw from the Aisne at the wish of the British government and Sir John French in the first week of October. After some delays through its trains having to traverse laterally the railway communications of the French front, it began to arrive in the neighborhood of Saint-Omer. Here it was joined by its cavalry, which had marched behind the French lines. This army, now made up to rather more than full strength, advanced from Saint-Omer and deployed along the very front from La Bassée to Ypres, upon which Falkenhayn's new offensive was about to fall. At the same time, the British cabinet showed itself strongly disposed to aid and stimulate the Belgian defense of Antwerp, whose forts were falling one by one under the enormous howitzers lent by Austria. The Royal Naval Division arrived in the threatened city, and its evacuation by the Belgians was delayed by 5 days. Lord Kitchener, exerting himself for the salvation of Antwerp, sent the last available British regular division, the 7th, collected from the fortresses of the Empire, together with a cavalry division and a brigade of Fusiliers Marines and a territorial division obtained from the French, all under General Rawlinson, to the neighborhood of Ghent. Both sides were in equal ignorance about each other's intentions. Lord Kitchener and his colleagues had, of course, no knowledge of the powerful forces which Falkenhayn was about to lose. Falkenhayn and the Supreme Command were perplexed by unexpected contacts around Bruges and between Ghent and Antwerp with British regular cavalry and the advanced troops of well-known British regiments. The British army was missing from the Aisne, and French troops had replaced them in their old positions. There seemed more than a possibility of a strong British thrust being delivered from the seacoast against the right flank of the intended German advance. It was judged necessary, therefore, to delay the march of the 4 new German army corps, which were now detraining in Belgium until the coast from Antwerp and Ostend had been cleared of the Belgian army, and its British allies of uncertain and unmeasured strength. It was not until October 9, the day the Germans entered Antwerp, that the general advance southward began, and not until October 11 that the German troops opposite La Bassée and Armentières came into collision with the advance guards of the British Second Corps under Smith-Dorrien. Close, fierce fighting immediately began, and neither side could make any progress. The British Third Corps, under Pulteney, which came into the line near Armentières, was equally held. The downward advance of the 4 new army corps towards Ypres and Dunkirk would have turned the left of the British battle now raging from La Bassée and Armentières. But Sir John French, with soldierly daring, sent his 1st Army Corps under Haig to Ypres to meet these enemies of unknown strength, and trusted to fortune, to the cavalry, and to the arrival of further detachments to skin over the wide gap between his 2 main bodies. At Ypres, Haig found Rawlinson with the 7th Division and his cavalry, and a new collision with the German masses of a most bloody and desperate character occurred. Farther to the north again, King Albert and his army, aided by the heroic Fusilier Marine and Admiral Ronnac, and by the monitors and other bombarding vessels with several flotillas from the British Navy, turned to bay along the line of the Yser. Along this whole front from La Bassée to the sea, an intensifying battle now flared. The Belgians, under British impulsion, opened the sluices, and the sea poured over the flat ground, causing large inundations and bringing the advance of the German right, the 3rd Reserve Corps, to an absolute standstill. No progress could be made, therefore, by either horn of the German attack. Falkenhayn then reduced the scope of his plan and from the 20th of October onwards aimed only at a breakthrough in the center at Ypres and Armentières. He encountered an unyielding resistance. By October 30 he was forced to restrict his ambitions to the mere capture of Ypres. Upon this task his new army corps were launched in all their youthful ardor. Supported by bombardments of their heavy artillery, the flower of German youth and patriotism advanced in seemingly overwhelming numbers, often in close order, hand in hand singing their national songs. They were met by what had now become little more than a picket line of long-service British regulars skilled in the use of the rifle and with a few machine guns, crouching in deep disconnected holes, which they were unable or unwilling to quit. Appalling slaughter was inflicted upon the German masses. Attacks renewed again and again with patriotic devotion withered before the well-directed rifle fire. But Falkenhayn and the Kaiser, who had now come to regard Ypres as a trophy indispensable to the prestige of the German army, persisted obstinately, and not till after the middle of November did they finally accept the fact that the fronts in the west were stabilized from Switzerland to the North Sea. These memorable events have been thus briefly recounted for the purpose of showing their repercussion in the east. The driving of the Russians from East Prussia gave Hindenburg and Ludendorff the chance to take stock of the position of their southern ally. The Imperial and Royal Austro-Hungarian armies, regathering, mutilated, disorganized, and discouraged far behind the sun, presented a woeful spectacle. Falkenhayn found himself confronted not only with the Austrian demands for help, but with the acrid reproaches of Conrad that the guaranteed aid had not arrived in time. The condition of the Austrian armies had the ever-present danger that Vienna, if deserted, would make a separate peace, added arguments of greater weight than complaints or pledges. Nevertheless, Falkenhayn, at first set on reviving the Schlieffen plan and later absorbed in the race to the sea, continued obdurate to the Austrian appeals. He would not at the moment send troops from the west. Any aid to Austria must come from the forces of which Hindenburg and Ludendorff already disposed. Accordingly, after some discussions by telephone between the 2 German headquarters, 4 corps were withdrawn from the 8th Army, railed swiftly southwards and deployed in the region north of Krakow. Thus was constituted the new German 9th Army, which should form along the Silesian frontier a force capable of sustaining the Austrians on their northern wing. Hindenburg and Ludendorff directed the movements of both the 8th and 9th Armies and, for the time being, assumed direct command of the 9th. So expeditious was the transportation that in the third week of September the 9th German Army, formed largely of troops who had been fighting in East Prussia a week before and comprising perhaps 250,000 men, stood along a 100-mile line from the north of Posen to the east of Krakow. This army, as the map will show, faced the original gap in the Russian front from the south of Warsaw to Ivangorod, which has been already mentioned. The new thrust was ready, and it was aimed at what might well be a deadly spot. Russia in the first shock had experienced checkered fortune upon a gigantic scale. In the south a great victory had been gained by 1.25 million Russian soldiers. In the north, armies of nearly 1 million had been torn to pieces and hurled in confusion back against the frontiers they had invaded. It was in this situation in mid-September that the French government made formal requests through diplomatic channels that the Russian armies should be brought to the left bank of the Vistula and assembled for the direct invasion of Silesia. This was no doubt the shortest path to the heart of Germany. The southern bastion of Galicia and the Austrian armies which defended it were greatly reduced, but the triumphant grip of the German power on the northern bastion of East Prussia still exposed the longed-for operation to deadly peril from the north. The Grand Duke and the Stavka, who had little to learn upon this problem, resented the requests which reached them through their Foreign Office instead of from one headquarters to another, as an intrusion by the French government into Russian strategy. They would like nothing better than to invade Germany. This had been their intention from the outset. They were doing their best, but they alone must be judges of the time and the method. The Grand Duke, in rejoinder, asked various questions of Joffre. First, what did he propose to do in France if the Germans transferred the bulk of their forces from the west to the east? And secondly, whether this object was only to clear France and Alsace-Lorraine, or to advance to the Rhine, or indeed to penetrate to the center of Germany. Joffre replied on September 20 that the German army was in fact already tied to the west by the battles which had been fought and their resulting situation, and that the operations then in progress, that is, the race to the sea, would have the effect of keeping them there. As for the advance into Germany, it would of course be unlimited. Sazonov returned a reply to the French government which, though tactfully couched, was by no means encouraging. The French under their stresses became sharply critical, and the Russian ambassador in Paris, Izvolsky, appealed to his government to make further efforts to reassure them. On September 22, the Grand Duke held a conference at Kolm. Here it was decided to regroup the Russian armies in the Polish salient behind the Vistula as a preliminary to a general advance of the Russian center into Germany in spite of the danger they would run from the north. This must be warded off, and at first it was hoped that Ruzsky, with the 1st, 10th and 2nd armies now ranged behind the Niemen and the Narew, should be sufficient for this purpose. But after Ruzsky and Rennenkampf had portrayed the injuries which had been received, their armies were judged unequal to the task. The Grand Duke therefore decided that the 5th Army, Pleve, should be sent to Warsaw to reinforce the northwest front, now facing almost north, for its responsible task. This having been settled, the assembly in the center began. By the end of September, the Grand Duke had set in motion the immense displacement of his forces hitherto ranged against Austria, and during the first fortnight of October, 3 whole armies moving northwards by march and rail filled the front from the confluence of the San with the Vistula up to Warsaw. The 9th by march took the southernmost situation. The 4th by road and rail filled the center round Ivangorod, and the 5th joined hands with the 2nd Army round Warsaw. Thus the Grand Duke drew up 4 armies comprising 1.25 million men, either to favor the advance into Germany or to meet an impending German attack aimed at what had hitherto been the weakest part of the Russian line. These movements were, however, only in their early stages when, on September 28, the German Ninth Army, drawing with it in its forward movement the First Austrian Army on its right, began its advance eastward and northward towards Ivangorod. Up till now, the Stavka had no knowledge of the swift formation of this new army on the Posen-Krakau line, and still less of its actual advance. All had passed behind the screen. On September 30, a pocketbook taken from a dead German officer revealed to them the significant fact that only 2 German corps remained in East Prussia. Where were the other 4? Had they come south? This confirmed various nebulous indications, which had for some days past reached the headquarters of the Southwest Front, that German troops were being transferred by rail to the south. The Stavka therefore rightly divined that a considerable movement was in progress against them by a German army working closely with the Austrian left. All the dispositions already made were singularly appropriate to this revelation. The German advance was swift and steady. Driving back the covering Russian forces in 6 long marches, the Germans were already approaching the Vistula at the end of the first week of October. The object at which Hindenburg and Ludendorff aimed was to seize and hold all the crossings of the Vistula from its confluence with the San to Warsaw and, thus protected, strike at the central fortress itself. They knew from the enemy's wireless, which continued to babble unsuspectingly, that important Russian movements northwards were already in progress. They could not measure their scale. The magnitude of the Grand Duke's operations began quite independently of the German offensive, far exceeding the anticipations of the German High Command. But on October 9 an order found on a corps near Grodziak revealed the plan. Says Hindenburg, "From the confluence of the San to Warsaw, it appeared that we had 4 Russian armies to cope with, that is, about 60 divisions against 18 of ours. From Warsaw alone 14 enemy divisions were being employed against 5 on our side. That meant 224 Russian battalions to 60 German. The enemy's superiority was increased by the fact that, as a result of the previous fighting in East Prussia and France, as well as the long and exhausting marches of more than 200 miles over indescribable roads, our troops had been reduced to scarcely half establishment, and in some cases even to a quarter of their original strength. And these weakened units of ours were to meet fresh arrivals at full strength. The Siberian Corps, the elite of the Tsar's empire. The enemy's intention was to hold us fast along the Vistula, while a decisive attack from Warsaw was to spell our ruin. It was unquestionably a great plan of the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich. Indeed, the greatest I had known, and in my view it remained his greatest until he was transferred to the Caucasus. It required, indeed, all the confidence of dazzling victories, all the resources of iron will and cool audacity to induce Hindenburg and Ludendorff to press on into the gigantic arms which the Russian bear was spreading for the Hague. On they went. Few episodes in German military history show a more generous effort to relieve an ally, or a more just measure of their sense of superior quality over the Russians. It was perhaps the most sporting operation which has ever been admitted to the spheres of Teutonic strategy, but every precaution was taken for escape in the case of failure. No army ever advanced so resolutely with such complete arrangements for retreat. Bridges and tunnels were mined at the same time as they were repaired. The whole of the communication of the advancing army were organized so as to make the swiftest recoil possible. Thus prepared for the extremes of fortune, the Ninth Army, clasping Dunkel's Austrian First Army encouragingly with its right hand, came squarely up against the line of the Vistula. The Grand Duke must have been well content to see how conveniently he could convert the combination in progress of all his armies for the invasion of Germany into a trap for the new and, as it must have appeared to him, desperate German offensive. It was with justifiable hopes that the dispositions so forcibly described by Hindenburg were carried into effect. As Hindenburg advanced, he found himself opposed by ever-gathering masses, and these masses continued more and more to reach round his left, where Mackensen led the 17th German Corps. Heavy and continuous fighting developed on this flank, with the usual German tactical successes, captures of prisoners and cannon, but also with a sense of the constantly growing weight descending upon them. The Second Russian Army, erupting from Warsaw in a southwesterly direction, widely overlapped the German left. At the same time, the 4 Russian armies arrayed behind the Vistula sought at many points to force a passage. A Caucasian corps in which many Armenians served actually established themselves across the river in the marshes of Koshenice, 10 miles north of Ivangorod. If the foothold could be made good and a bridge built, this passage, together with the permanent fortress bridgehead of Ivangorod, would secure to the Russian the means of debouching on a broad front. A continuous struggle developed in the swamps between the Caucasians striving to advance and the Germans to pin them to the river bank. The Caucasians, says Hoffmann, fought with surprising bravery. The Russians' gun trails were literally in the Vistula. The survivors on both sides sustained a horrible impression of this small protracted battle on the brink. Nothing could dislodge the Caucasians. They clung tenaciously to their lodgment. They built their bridge. Meanwhile, farther to the south, the whole of Dunkel's First Army was gripped and menaced by another Russian army. Thus hung the scales on the southward wing when the German left before Warsaw became at once weighed down and outflanked. On October 12, Mackensen's group of 4 divisions was within 12 miles of Warsaw, holding an important railway junction almost in its perimeter. But the Russian preponderance of numbers and length of front soon became irresistible. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, at Radom, in fairly commodious quarters, were now the center of mental battles not less severe than those they were imposing physically upon their troops. Stubbornly they fought for victory. No general Austrian forward movement against the denuded Russian front across the Sun developed. The heavy rains flooded the countryside. Imperious demands upon Conrad for Austrian aid met with inadequate response. Dunkel, instead of sending Austrian troops to the left, would do no more than lengthen the front of the First Austrian Army and release the right-hand German corps, the 11th, which was immediately transferred to the threatened left. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, with their 4 army corps, were left locked in deadly battle with 4 whole Russian armies. Here we see, with unmistakable plainness, the ratios and values already established on the Eastern Front. The Germans fight with army corps, and the Russians with armies thrice their number, and the battle is still obstinate. But the moment came when flesh and blood could do more, when the whole German front was raked and strained to within an ace of catastrophe, which nothing but their well-wrought plans for escape could avert. On October 17, Hindenburg and Ludendorff dared persist no longer, and the orders for retreat were given. The withdrawal was speedy and deft. Through the sleet and slush of a Polish autumn, the Ninth Army retired by forced marches upon Silesia, devastating the country and blowing up the roads and railways behind them. This movement was the signal for pursuit by all the Russian armies. From the 19th onwards, the whole Russian front from Lava to the Sun River was rolling westward with all possible diligence. Says Hoffmann, I quite agree with the opinion of our eminently capable Quartermaster General, Privy Councillor Dr. Keber, that the advance of a German army must come to a standstill when it gets about 100 kilometers from the railway. We calculated that by giving the Russians an additional 20 kilometers, in consequence firstly of their exceedingly modest requirements, and secondly of their great want of consideration for their horses, we should be able to stop for a time the enemy advance while still on Russian soil to the east of the German frontier. He reckoned on a halt of several days. This period the Ninth Army would have at its disposal to begin new operations, and the time must be fully utilized. His calculation was vindicated. The Germans retreated, with more than one stubborn stand, in 6 days 60 miles, and by the end of October were, broadly speaking, back at their starting point. At this point, says Hindenburg, I cannot help admitting how much the punctual knowledge of the dangers that threatened us was facilitated by the incomprehensible lack of caution, I might also say naivete, with which the Russians used their wireless. By tapping the enemy's wireless, we were not only able to learn what the situation was, but also the intention of the enemy. Yet did it not look as if our final ruin had only been postponed for a time? The enemy certainly thought so and rejoiced. Apparently, he considered that we were completely beaten, for on November 1 his wireless ran, "Having followed the Germans up for more than 120 versts, it is time to hand over the pursuit to the cavalry. The infantry are tired and supplies short." We could therefore embark upon fresh operations. The recriminations incidental to failure were not lacking. The Germans reproached the First Austrian Army with having exposed their right at a critical moment by a needless retirement. They furthermore complained of the lack of any general advance across the San. Przemysl had, it is true, been temporarily disengaged from Russian investment, but otherwise, in the main, the spectacle of an energetic German force making head against heavy odds and difficult weather, while the very large armies of the dual monarchy seemed to palter with the weakened enemy upon their front, was vividly presented to the German mind and forcibly expressed to Austrian ears. But what was the use of finding fault with Austria? For good or for evil, there she was in the war, and the sole first-class ally. The Germans could not afford to quarrel with the Austrians. They could only slave for them, and suffer from them and with them. Nor was this any temporary impatience to be restrained for a while. It had become the enduring condition of German war on the Eastern Front. Whereas the German troops were equal to 2 or 3 times their numbers of Russians, it was obvious that the Austrian armies were incapable of fighting the Russians, man for man. No time was wasted in these sterile reflections. The need was urgent to rupture the impending Russian invasion of Silesia. The German Ninth Army had lost 40,000 men in its drive against Warsaw through South Poland. It must without delay strike again. But where? At the conference at Częstochow on November 3, decision was taken. Hindenburg imparted it by a gesture. He raised his left hand. All present understood and assented. The German front, which now faced northeast along the front from Posen to Krakow, must be reformed facing southeast from the level of Posen to the fortress of Thorn. The change was made with almost incredible swiftness. Again the busy railways had to hum. Again the perfect organization for military purposes of these lateral communications was proved. Again locomotives, wagons, and sidings enabled Germany to multiply her army by 2. Almost as soon as the Russians had exhausted their ardor of pursuit, the Ninth Army had vanished from their front. By November 10, it was deployed anew on a 70-mile front from the fortress of Thorn southwards to the Warta River. The right-handed frontal punch towards Warsaw to the south had failed to revive the Austrian ally. A left-handed flank blow was now to be struck to save Germany herself from invasion. Within less than a fortnight from the end of the retreat in South Poland, the Ninth Army was ready to advance upon a new offensive in a different guise, purpose, and direction, while the Russians were still sprawling in pursuit in regions where only ghosts remained.